We interrupt your busy life, which is probably trying to convince your gifted kid Shatner was the best Starfleet captain, to bring you a podcast that will never reduce your life to a lazy stereotype.
Welcome to the Mind.
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters.
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
Podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness.
Originals are nonconformists.
Creativity.
People who not only have new ideas.
Intelligence.
They're the people you want to bet on.
In childhood.
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
And beyond. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Hey there, everyone. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and you're listening to episode 16 of the Mind Matters podcast. Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Richard Cash about how to take the concept of self-regulation and put it in place in the classroom to maximize student achievement. Before we jump into our interview today, I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to answer some of the questions that have come to us through social media and our website. Don't forget that you're always welcome to send us your thoughts and comments. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Mind Matters Podcast, and on Twitter, we're at Mind Matters Pod. The first question is from Reddit. It's from Carrie, and Carrie wonders about test anxiety. Her daughter shows mixed results on tests, and sometimes has some wide swings in subjects like math and reading. One of the things that I noticed about test anxiety is too much anxiety definitely causes scores to be suppressed, but some level of anxiety is necessary to achieve peak performance too. The trick is to find the just right amount of anxiety. I don't know, something like that. So when we're working with these kids, we've got to find out what is the cause of the anxiety, what's underlying that sign of stress and worry, so that we can find ways to mitigate them. So is the child anxious when they're working on an assessment in a group setting because the other kids are finishing more quickly than they are? Are they feeling anxious because they have to write an essay by hand, and that can be a struggle for them? If they're in a one-on-one testing situation, is social anxiety getting the best of them? As we look at these types of assessments, I think a really good way to work around this is to start by asking the question, what is it that we're trying to measure? So that we can determine how we can modify an assessment for a child to reduce anxiety. If what we're really trying to get at is how well a child comprehends a reading passage, but he feels anxious about writing, can we allow that child to record their answers with an audio device or answer orally to the teacher? If we know that a kid stresses out around strangers, how can we make sure that that child has the time to build solid rapport before jumping into an individual assessment? When we isolate the objective and eliminate the anxiety-provoking events, we're going to get the best picture and accurate read on where a child is actually achieving. So let's stay with our Reddit comments for a minute. We have another Redditor who mentions that we have systems in place in schools to help gifted kids, but wonders about ways to manage the challenges afterwards once we're in adulthood. It's kind of funny when I hear adults say, when I was in school, I was gifted. Because actually, if you were gifted when you were in school, you're still gifted as an adult. But it is true that there are very few supports in place for adults beyond their K-12 education. I believe that as people enter adulthood, they tend to find their tribe, a lot of times through their college major and their career, because they can find other people with similar interest and ability. Side note, IQ scores between partners have a correlation rate of approximately 0.42, meaning that we tend to enter relationships with people with similar ability levels to our own. But beyond that, as far as formal structure to support high-ability adults, as a society, we are lacking. Some people choose to join organizations like Mensa, but that doesn't change the fact that our workplaces, where we spend a majority of our adult lives, don't provide a lot of explicit support to GT individuals. I think in a lot of ways, we are lucky in this day and age to have the internet. Online forums and groups are a great way to meet people with similar interests and ability, especially when you're talking about only a small percentage of the overall population. If anyone has any additional ideas or places to look for these types of supports, please send them our way and we'll definitely pass them along. Finally, a comment from a Facebook follower who says her son likes to go all in on a hobby, only to lose interest soon after. He even realizes that he gets no real joy from his hobbies. She's wondering if this is a typical trait of giftedness. As I thought about this, I was thinking that there could be a variety of causes associated with this type of behavior with gifted kids. It definitely could be giftedness. When we look at the Big 5 factor personality model, The trait of openness is most highly correlated with intelligence, and it identifies the need for variety or novelty as a component of this characteristic. So her son could be seeking new and different experiences and just kind of going through them rather rapidly. Another possibility is that this could be influenced by perfectionism. Is he attempting a task and then feeling frustrated because he isn't reaching mastery as quickly as he feels he should? If so, we could work with him on developing persistence and setting realistic and achievable goals. Or this could even be a sign of something that's more concerning and possibly even clinical. Possibly an attention deficit. How focused is he when he is engaged in these types of tasks? Or even possibly depression. Does he get enjoyment out of other areas of his life, or is he generally lacking pleasure and happiness overall? Take that last piece with a grain of salt. My first instinct is that there's no big deal here, but if other factors do begin to show up in those areas, it may be worth considering. Okay, so a quick shout out to a few of our new Twitter followers. At Dr. Amy is a childhood trauma and attachment physician. At Amanda Morin, she is an author and SPED advocate. And Potential Plus, which is at PPUK_, and they are a parenting advocacy group in the UK. Richard Cash is our guest, and he'll be along in just a minute.
On a recent episode of Mind Matters.
Because of the hyper-focus on testing, schools that have high poverty populations tend to focus so much on test prep and don't feel oftentimes that they have room for creativity.
If you're trying to wrap your head around what this creativity kind of looks like, it's really about problem solving and being curious enough to find the problems.
You would hope that curiosity would deepen, but what we find is that in general, curiosity diminishes with age. Adults in the sciences remain incredibly curious. Their curiosity just deepens.
That's episode 5, available at mindmatterspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
In the area of self-regulation, not many have better chops than Dr. Richard Cash. He spent many years in the field of gifted education, most recently as Director of Gifted Programs for the Bloomington, Minnesota Public Schools. He has a doctorate in educational leadership and a master's degree in curriculum and instruction. Dr. Cash, why don't you tell everyone what you're up to now?
Well, hi, Emily. I am a educational consultant now, coming from about 30 years of classroom and administrative work with gifted and talented kids.
So in the field of mental health, when I'm talking to families about self-regulation, we're often talking about managing emotions. You're sort of pushing the envelope to include self-regulation in the educational setting. How does that look in the learning environment?
Yeah, well, it's actually tridimensional. So there's actually 3 components to it. Based on my research and now as I work in schools, seeing how these 3 different angles or dimensions of the learner really play together. Like you said, a lot of times people think of it as that social and emotional side to us. And some people will say executive functioning. I think there's a bigger picture here. So there is that affective side, how we feel about a learning situation, how that impacts the way that our brain will actually focus its attention. Because if you're feeling fearful or stressed out or anxious or like people don't like you or like the teacher doesn't like you, your brain naturally sends the blood energy into what's called a downshift, and that goes into the reptilian brain. So you go into this fight or flight dimension of your brain where you're not able to process then the information at the higher levels in the prefrontal cortex or even in the frontal cortex to do any of those levels of thinking that you need. So I think the affective dimension is one of the most critical for us to pay attention to, because how kids feel about a learning situation is going to determine the focus of their attention. Then there's the behavioral side to it. So what are the strategies that we're learning in school, everywhere from literacy strategies to how to work in a group to walking down the hallway to playing out on the playground. Those are all behavioral strategies that you have to be aware of. And then the third dimension is the cognitive dimension, which goes all the way from the metacognitive level, that just thinking about your own thinking, but that really in kid language would be the reflective activity. You know, how do I think about what I'm doing? How do I think about what happened 10 minutes ago? Or what do I plan to do next? That kind of thinking structure. Then I've defined what is called infracognition, and infracognition is the thinking strategies of creative thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, and decision making. And those are natural to us as human beings, but now for today's complex world, they have to be developed at a much higher level because we're dealing with more advanced ways of thinking, of solving problems than just where's the saber-toothed tiger. And then the final level, which really came out of my work with gifted kids, is a metaphysical cognitive level, so that thinking beyond the self, so that processing existentially, theoretically, philosophically, that all that advanced level of thinking is what is called metaphysical cognition.
So awareness of these different areas happens at different times for different people. Would you say that IQ also plays a role in when those people become more self-aware?
What I've found in my work with gifted kids is that the higher the IQ, the more likely they are to hit metaphysical cognition earlier. All people will eventually get to metaphysical cognition because that's a prefrontal cortex kind of higher level reasoning thought process. But I've found that the higher the IQ, the quicker kids get there. So I've got examples of my first graders when I taught first grade that they were thinking metaphysically. I've had, little kids would come up to me and say things like, what happens when we die? And they didn't want to know the decomposition part of it or fear because their grandmother was going to die or something like that. They really wanted to know what's that kind of existential thing that happens. And this was kind of a wake-up call for me because, I never really completely 100% understood the asynchrony. Never understood really what that meant. Well, when I started studying self-regulation, that's when it hit me. It's these kids that are thinking at the metaphysical cognitive level, which then may throw off the behavioral part. So I say that we've got the ABCs of learning: affect, behavior, and cognition. They all have to work in tandem or help balance each other out. So here you have these really smart, gifted kids that are thinking existentially, and they can't manage the feelings part of it because they don't know what to do with it. They don't know what, you've got kids that are 6-7 years old wanting to solve world hunger, and they panic because they don't know what to do with it.
So what I hear you saying is that we can help coach them through this, but the baseline that we need is some emotional literacy. Is that fair to say?
Yes. The reason I'm hesitating on it because you can't isolate one without working on the other two. However, I think in today's culture, because kids are, kind of born with the technologies in their hand, and we're so fast as a society that everything's moving quickly, and there's that whole sense of instant gratification. When I was a kid, my parents didn't have a television to prop us down in front of to keep us from, just be quiet and sit there and watch TV for the next hour. I mean, my generation didn't have that need for instant gratification, but parents that were raised in the 70s were starting to be raised on that need for screen time, which takes that whole learning process and makes it much more difficult because learning isn't instant. It's a developmental process. Kids get frustrated, and the frustration is a feeling. They don't know what to do then. And so that affect, how do I manage my emotional responses, is I think very, very critical in the learning setting, and getting kids to be aware of it. How am I feeling right now, and what can I do to manage that feeling?
It's hard to generalize developmental advice because we're all a little differently wired, but at what age would you say we should start working on these challenges?
right away, right away. Well, as a mental health person, the brain of a 4-year-old is vastly different than that of a 6-year-old because of the whole developmental process of the hippocampus and the midbrain, basically. To really be able to recognize and analyze or even to interpret your own feelings, it's really about late pre-kindergarten into kindergarten to really start recognizing the difference between, the natural response versus that which we can control. But you start very concretely, as you do with little guys. And as they get older, you can build that up further and further.
What would it look like as kids get older? Once they're, say, in intermediate or middle grades or even in high school?
Working with an adolescent's like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree.
True.
Again, you go back to the same ideas of just keep it simple. Help kids unpack why are you feeling that way, and especially during the middle school years, I think it's really, really super important that we teach kids that they and only they control their feelings. Your feelings are yours. They're nobody else's. Nobody can make you feel anything. You feel it based on what they may do to you, but they didn't make you feel that way. You did it. And then how do you take that control back and say, and I always say, take your power back. Don't let someone make you feel that way, because that's what's happening is they're doing something and then they are making you feel that way, and then you get trapped. Adolescents sometimes just don't know how to get out of the problem. And so it's being able to recognize who are the people that I can go to, who do I trust, and especially if you're an outlier kid or a kid who is, and actually, which is kind of the dichotomy of adolescence, is that all adolescents want to be alike, but totally different.
That's true.
So you've got these adolescents who might be gay or bisexual or transgendered, or, just they work differently, they think differently, they might be ASD or, have emotional issues, but knowing the safe places. And I think that's really the critical component at middle school, is knowing where the safe places are, where you can really share that feeling stuff, and then it's not weird and it's not strange and you're not that different than everybody else. Then you start getting into these cliques or these subgroups, and the research probably as well as I do about it's who you hang out with that has a greater impact on your achievement than does schooling in general. And so helping kids understand when the groupthink can control how you feel about things.
Just as kids transition into that school year, especially those gifted or twice exceptional kids, what are some considerations that teachers and parents should take into account regarding this skill of using self-regulation for learning?
We have to understand that every child is a unique individual, and I really try to avoid any of that pathologizing. I think kids have to know that they're unique individuals, that you are going to be different than some kids, and you're going to be alike in some ways. So trying to find both the similarities and differences that you have with others. How does that make you feel when you are different, and is it okay to be different? That becomes the teacher's responsibility to allow for that community of difference to be about uniqueness, that everybody's got a unique thing to give and share with others. And then the behavioral aspect of grouping and working with others who are like you, who are different than you. Self-belief and self-efficacy, how do I believe in myself? How do I know that I've got the tools and skills to do this? So it's keeping those questions always in mind, and with parents, helping them help their child, saying, well, how does that make you feel? What did you do that worked or didn't work today? And what do you think you should do next time? What's your belief that you should be doing next time? So it's, I think, all three entities, student, teacher, and parent, working in tandem on balancing those three together and not just doing one in isolation.
with self-regulation, when you write about it, there are some very specific kind of components that go into that. I heard you mentioning kind of some metacognitive skills just a second ago, kind of talking about that thinking about thinking and revisiting. What are some of those other components that kind of go into the thought process of the self-regulation?
So number one on the cognitive side, let's talk metacognition, reflection. That's a very, very simple task that we can ask kids to do is reflect. The unfortunate thing is during the school day, we don't provide kids time to think. We are in such a hurry to cover the curriculum that kids move from one place to the other and never have a moment to stop and think. We don't teach kids how to think. We don't give them the protocols of thinking. So I, again, go back to the very simple ABC. How does that make you feel? What are you going to do with it? And then what do you think the next step should be? So I'm always telling teachers that a very simple tool you can use is called 10 to 2. For every 10 minutes of what is considered didactic instruction, and didactic is one way. So it's usually auditory, where you're listening to something, or observable, visual, so you're actually watching it, that you actually stop after about 10 minutes and you have your kids then process that information. Use the metacognitive process there and say, what did you just learn? How does that make you feel? What do you think you're going to do with it? That kind of immediacy to the learning process. And I will hear teachers all the time tell me, I don't have time to stop every 10 minutes in class. And I said, well, you're going to cover it. They're not going to learn it because their little brains cannot hold on to that much information. Even an adult brain can't hold on to that much information. The brain gets really tired. It really starts to disengage after about 10 minutes. So a quick little every 10 minutes, just do something with that information. Talk about it. Share it with somebody. Practice it. Do something else. Stand up, stretch, reignite your brain. That's a very simple metacognitive process.
Tell me about the process you call the 3-2-1 ticket.
In some cases, teachers will use it as a 3-2-1 exit ticket, or in some cases, you can use it as a 3-2-1 entrance ticket. In the exit ticket 3-2-1, it's 3 things you learned from this session, 2 connections you made, 1 thing that you would like to ask about tomorrow. So kids spend about 3 to 5 minutes writing out their 3-2-1, and then as they walk out the door, it's on a Post-it note, and they post it on the door, and then the teacher collects that information, and that's kind of a teacher evaluative form there. It says, did the kids get what I wanted them to get? What are the questions that they're going to have for me tomorrow? So it's not only a reflection for the student, but it's also a reflection for the teacher. Now, on the 3-2-1 entrance ticket, that's something that kids do at home. So, the research is really clear about this, that homework has little to no value in learning K through 12, pretty much. But what it does have value for is helping kids become self-regulated. So it teaches them a process to study. So I talk about, let's stop calling it homework and let's call it home study, because it's a format of studying. And one of those formats of studying is going home without any of your notes from the school day and do a 3-2-1. What were 3 things that you remember from the day? What are 2 connections you made to that information from other sources? And then one question you'd like to ask tomorrow morning. So same kind of format. It's a much more beneficial way of reflecting on the information so that you keep that information in your working memory fresh so that it is then usable for the next day. For older students, leave your notes at school and then go home and try to recreate the notes. And then the next day when you come back, then you reflect on that. You look at and say, what did I remember that I was able to write down in my notes from at home versus what I wrote down at school? It has to be done relatively immediately in the classroom, and then also doing that after school in the evening kind of reflective process too. And I always challenge school districts or schools. I say, I will guarantee you, and prove me wrong, that behavior issues escalate in the afternoon. There are hardly many huge behavior issues in the morning periods. They're mostly in the afternoon because they're tired. their little brains are tired, and especially boys. They get mentally fatigued, and then they start acting out because they're sending us a message. And what I say is behavior tends to be a symptom. Where's the source? And I would most likely consider that source to be the affect. They just don't feel good about where they're at, and they don't know how to connect with it. They don't know how to manage it. They don't know what to do with it. And confidence goes off, which is the cognition. What do I do? I don't know how to do this. I'm frustrated, therefore I'm going to explode, and they become problems. It's because we've not given kids time to think. And then both physically get up and move around, but also that time to process information so everything's not like a train running through your brain that gets stopped by a brick wall and all the cars are crashing up against it because you haven't had time to process any of that information, and now nothing makes sense.
What about for parents? What can they do to help support the development of this type of self-regulation at home with their kids?
The parents themselves should learn about what self-regulation is.
True.
And understand the ABCs. But it's also taking time to listen, truly listen to their child, not just hear them, but actually listen to them. Help the parent kind of parse out the thought processes that the child is having, helping their child unpack it. So that's how you feel. Interesting. It's trying not to be judgmental about anything. And I know that's hard for parents, but it's sometimes you just have to sit and listen so that you can help the child unpack that. Another thing is recognizing what your kid is good at and recognizing where your kid needs the supports. Because no one's good at everything, but everyone's good at something. And so helping your child understand, maybe that type of learning is not the best for you. However, you're going to have to learn how to deal with that kind of a learning situation. It's not that I'm going to pull you out. And that's the other thing that I get kind of frustrated with parents is that they let their child give up too quickly. They're not teaching their child any sense of patience and persistence, nor kind of that sense of suck it up. Suck it up. You signed up for this. You finish it. You finish the process. Holding kids accountable for those kinds of things. So my dad was a military guy, so it was very structured. And when we started something, we had to finish it, which taught us that, before you start something, think about it. Is it something that you're willing to complete? Now, I'm not suggesting that kids can't change their minds, but you have to follow through on things. So I think it's teaching kids how to consider what they've signed up for and what they have control over and what they don't have control over. That's the other thing, is that in a classroom, kids have choices, but choices aren't always those things that you want to do. The choices might be you do it this way or you do it this way, not your way.
What about twice exceptional learners? Are there additional supports or accommodations that we need to consider to help them put these skills into action?
As you were saying this, I'm running through my head all the 2E kids that I've ever encountered in my life. And kind of the adage goes, if you've met a 2E kid, you've met one 2E kid. They're not all alike. There's so many variances and so many differences. And I'm always very cautious about 2E because, the disability can mask the ability and the ability can mask the disability. One of the children that I worked with for many years, all the way through my years as an administrator in my school district, the parent that I found to be the most effective was the parent that put equal responsibility on the child as well as the system. When parents became the helicopter, lawnmower, snowplow, whatever you want to call them, parent, the child didn't have any ownership, didn't have any responsibility to it. It was all a shame and blame game. It's your fault that I'm this way. The parent and parents that I've worked with that have said, this is an equal share. We're all in this together. That they also held their child accountable for certain things, and it wasn't an excuse. I'm only 5'5". That's not an excuse. So you find the accommodations and you start to realize what are the accommodations you need. So like for me, around my house, there has to be a step stool relatively close because I've got 12.5-foot ceilings, which means things are high up in my place. Well, I know where the ladder is. Go find the ladder. And so that's kind of my analogy about it, is that we've got to teach 2E kids what you're good at, where you're going to find your difficulties, teach your kids the tools, and hold them accountable to using the tools.
Any final thoughts?
The thing that I learned the most doing in my research on self-regulation was the idea that they're all interrelated. The ABCs are all interrelated. You cannot isolate out one and expect the other two to come along with it. You have to work with all three. Feelings, behaviors, cognition, all have to work in tandem. I'm even using that in my daily life now. I'll get frustrated about what's going on the freeway, because I'm not getting to my appointment on time because of road construction and all this. And then I actually have to stop myself and say, A, you're feeling frustrated right now. B, your behavior. Now, I can let the frustration take over. Okay, stop and think. I'm going to be late. No one's going to die because I'm late. It's all going to be okay. A, I'm calming down. B, I'm going to not hold the steering wheel so tight. C, I'm feeling better. So I think that is probably the nugget I would have people walk away with, is that they're dimensions that have to work together to be self-regulated.
That's Richard Cash, author of Self-Regulation in the Classroom. Thanks a lot, Richard.
Thank you.
More in a minute.
To reach the Mind Matters podcast, go to our website, mindmatterspodcast.com, and click on Contact. Follow us on Twitter @MindMattersPod, on Facebook Mind Matters Podcast, or you can reach our YouTube channel through our website. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
So, what do we do when gifted kids get stuck when they're in the classroom? As Dr. Cash shared, the intersection of affect, behavior, and cognition must be aligned for a student to learn effectively. We can use this as educators and parents when we try to analyze what's happening with a child who's having some trouble. Is she struggling with task initiation because she's worried about how the product will turn out? Is he struggling with a peer relationship and expectations for group work? Sometimes, as educators and parents, the most obvious piece for us to see in a dysregulated student is their behavior, the child who is acting out or refusing to work. What we must remember is that all behavior is communication. When they show us that there's a problem, we can take that opportunity to reflect with a student to understand the underlying emotion and help them build the metacognitive skills associated with reflecting on their own thoughts and emotions so they can learn to shift their actions. This is the essence of self-regulation, and it's necessary for academic achievement in the classroom. It's also important to recognize that these signs of emotional dysregulation can be subtle. It can be a student who's rushing through their work, or forgetting their homework, or spacing out during a lesson. We need to help students to self-identify these signs through their own awareness, and then identify the affect and the cognition that's associated with them. And when they're able to balance all three, they'll gain confidence as students and emotional well-being throughout their lives. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. We'll see you in a couple weeks with another edition of Mind Matters.
There's a hole in the gray sky where the sun comes through. Baby, can't you see the patch of blue? There's a silver lining if you care to see that things aren't as dark as they sometimes seem to be. Everything changes, nothing stays the same. Everything changes, only change remains.
Thanks for listening to the Mind Matters podcast with Emily Kircher-Morris. To learn more about us and our mission, go to mindmatterspodcast.com. If you'd like to show your support for Mind Matters, find us in Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe and leave us a positive review. Follow us on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod or on Facebook at facebook.com/Mind Matters Podcast. Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.